Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If you could please find a seat. I'm Tom Lerner, Senior Scientist and Head of Contemporary Art Research at the Getty Conservation Institute, the GCI, and it's my great pleasure tonight to welcome you here this evening to our panel discussion, The Object in Transition, Contemporary Voices. This event is part of Conservation Matters, the ongoing series of public lectures organised by the GCI. Before getting started, I would like to remind you all please to check your cell phones are switched off and to say that there will be a small reception after the discussion tonight. It was going to be outside the auditorium, but it's going to be crammed into the lobby of the auditorium, to which everyone here is invited. The way in which artists make their art is fascinating. The statement would appear to be supported by the fact that so many of you have turned out here tonight, despite the known and expected horrors of Los Angeles rush hour traffic and the much less known and definitely less expected phenomenon, at least in LA, of this wet and rather traditional material called rain. However, for any work of art, the choice of materials and the way in which they are used also has important implications for how that piece is interpreted, how it is exhibited, how it will change with time, and therefore how it is best preserved or not. Given the complex and ephemeral nature of many modern materials, conservators, art historians, and curators are frequently faced with considerable challenges over these and other issues. Artists clearly also have much to offer in this debate, for example, over what would be considered acceptable aging in their work, or how aggressively collectors and institutions should intervene in conserving these pieces. Tonight, we are going to hear directly from three of the leading contemporary artists in the world today in what promises to be a fascinating insight into their working methods and practices and their opinions of their own objects in transition as they start to age. And unfortunately, I do mean three artists. Sadly, Robert Gober is not able to be with us tonight. However, our other advertised artists, Rachel Harrison, Paul McCarthy, and Doris Salcedo, are all here, along with Christian Scheidemann and curator Elisabeth Sussman. Our panel discussion tonight also serves another purpose. It is the first event of a major professional conference, the Object in Transition, a cross-disciplinary conference on the preservation and study of modern and contemporary art, which has jointly been organised by the GCI and the Getty Research Institute, the GRI. Over the next 2 days, art historians, artists, conservators, curators, and representatives from other areas in the art profession, try not to leave anyone out there, will be examining, and in many cases re-examining, some of the most problematic issues that are being posed by the conservation of contemporary artworks today. I know significant numbers of the conference delegates are in the audience tonight, so the person sitting next to you could well be from any one of the 16 countries, all three continents being represented by the conference, at the conference. It is now my great pleasure to introduce you to Elisabeth Sussman, our moderator for tonight's discussion, who will in turn introduce the members of the panel as they come up to the table here. Elisabeth is curator and Sondra Gilman Curator of Photography at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. She curated the exhibition Gordon Matter Clark, You Are the Measure, which just closed in the Museum of Contemporary Art here in Los Angeles. It was also shown at the Whitney, where it won the prize for Best Monographic Museum Show in New York City from the International Association of Art Critics. Many of you will also be familiar with Elisabeth's research and curating of exhibitions on the work of Eva Hesse, including the two New York shows in 2006, Eva Hesse Sculpture and Eva Hesse Drawings, at the Jewish Museum and Drawing Center respectively, as well as the full retrospective for the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art in 2002. I was going to mention that she also wrote the catalogue essay for Robert Gober's exhibition at Schaulager last year, but since he's not here, I don't think I should. For the last 3 years, and it's probably more than 3 years, she's been working very closely with the GCI and GRI, developing the content for this evening's event as well as tomorrow's conference. And this is how I have come to know her. And I can therefore personally vouch for the fact that she is wonderful to work with. So please join me in welcoming Elisabeth Sussman and our panel tonight.
Tom. You've said many things that I was going to say, but I'll repeat them anyway. Thank you all for coming. I will just say a word about my own involvement with tonight's subject and then turn this panel over quickly to the artists and to Christian Scheidemann. Though I was trained very traditionally as an art historian, I began to be seriously interested in how artists make work for the first time in the mid-'80s. Even though then, when I started going to studios seriously, I was caught up in the theoretical arguments, which, as you all know, were the rage of the 80s art world: image appropriation, media critique, institutional critique, et cetera, and I could go on at length. When I began to visit studios seriously, conversations which may have started out to be about content soon became an invitation to have a glimpse into artists' process. As I started to work with artists such as Robert Gober and was confronted in his studio with painted fabric that he had painted himself to cover a chair that he had made himself, with Rosemary Trockle, who brought a sculpture to put in a show of her work that I organized that had a living spider in it, with Janine Antoni, who brought into another exhibition I worked on a perfect cube of lard that proceeded to melt under the conditions of gallery exhibition. As I went on to, and I will talk about this in a moment, to work with Gordon Matta Clark and Eva Hesse, who were, unfortunately, I was not able to visit when they had studios, I began to realize that the discussion of the nuts and bolts that went on behind the scenes was much more interesting, or equally as interesting, as some of the theoretical arguments that I was involved in. So therefore, my interest in artists, in materials, in materiality began in earnest, and it goes on until this day. So tonight we will talk about some of these conditions as they evolve in artists, as work goes from studio to institution to collector. And I think that we can truly say that curators over the last 20 years who have stayed within theoretical arguments, who have not looked behind the scenes into to see what the process of what goes on in a studio, or what an artist, the questions that are asked as the artwork comes into being, they are missing something, and that something seems to be increasingly the serious work of conservators. So I think that is why so many of us have come together to consider these questions, and tonight to ask them directly to the artists who have been invited to talk, who have all taken great risks to realize in whatever materials are necessary the great works that they have made. I am going to introduce each of these artists to you, and then Christian Scheidemann, who is the conservator I have worked most closely with on some of the problems I've encountered with artists. And so I will begin with introducing Rachel Harrison, who is seated here on my left. Rachel attended Wesleyan. She now has a studio in New York, and she has been exhibiting, from what I can tell, in group shows since around 1991, and in solo shows since around 1996. Her first solo show in Brooklyn had the most amazing title, which I'm going to read to you in length. It's called, the name of it was "Should Home Windows or Shutters Be Required to Withstand a Direct Hit from an 8-foot-long 2x4 shot from a cannon at 3/4 miles an hour without creating a hole big enough to let through a 3-inch sphere?" Is that right? Harrison has been in many group exhibitions, including the inaugural exhibition at the New Museum of Contemporary Art in New York now, the fourth Berlin Biennial, which was called, and in the 2006 Carnegie International, the Whitney Biennial of 2002, and she was the subject of a recent mid-career survey, The Voyage of the Beagle, at the Migros Museum in Zurich this past summer.
Wasn't in the
No?
No, it was just a solo show.
Solo show. Yeah. So I am going to now turn the podium over to you, Rachel.
Does someone else turn this on, or do I? It's funny that, and thank you all for coming. It's funny that Elisabeth mentioned, should home windows or shutters be required to withstand a direct hit from a 8-foot-long 2x4? I can't remember it anymore. I didn't know she was going to mention that. That was the first solo show I did in New York in 1996 in Brooklyn. And I considered, it's nice that you bring that up, because that sentence, the title for the exhibition, was a found object. It was the lead sentence for an article in the New York Times about hurricanes. It was the year of Hurricane Andrew in Florida. And so it was about insurance codes and scientists, and we're here with an audience of scientists tonight, talking about devising mechanisms, machines, in order to see if a cannon could be shot, or a 2x4 could be shot through a cannon. So there's two reasons why it's nice to hear that sentence again. One is because of my interest in found objects, or purchased objects, or objects that are given to me. And the second is because it involved a can, because part of that exhibition, a can of peas is actually 3-inch diameter. So that exhibition had canned peas in it. This is a piece called Day's Grape that I made in 2001. The soda at the top, it's a sculpture. It's about 8 foot tall. And at the top, there's a case of shrink-wrapped soda. And the soda is called Day's Grape. So that's the title of this piece. This piece, was made in my modest Brooklyn studio and then shown in a gallery in Berlin, and then, in storage, and then taken to the Milan Art Fair later that year. And I guess during the night somebody got thirsty because they took out a ladder and went in and drank a can of soda. So I didn't go to the art fair, but the guy who had it in his booth, I got this call saying, oh, well, I'm really sorry, but somebody took it out, and it's shrink wrap. That's a case of shrink wrap soda up there. So they took the can out, they drank the soda, and then I guess to show me how much they liked my work, they left the empty can at the base of the sculpture. So I was able to find the soda again. So FedExed it to Europe, and the piece didn't sell, so it came back to New York anyway. So then you move ahead a bunch of years, and the piece, Day's Grape, was living in Philadelphia, and it was living in a house where the people who lived in the house went out of town, and when they got back, one of the cans had exploded. So the really good thing here was it didn't hit the Ellsworth Kelly, because I never would have recovered. That would have killed me. So I had already met Christian, but called up Christian, okay, we got this problem here. So we started looking for the soda, and they changed the packaging. So I'll show you both of them. So this was the new packaging on the soda, and it turns out that I like it better. So it was a nice thing. So we got the soda back, and what we had to do was empty out the cans, fill them with sand, and then re-shrink wrap the packaging. This is the damaged box. So not to bore you, but so you can see here that it's cardboard. The original was unpainted cardboard. So just in terms of conversations that we had at the time about how to restore this work, I had the option of remaking this piece in terms of remaking that cardboard packaging. That I didn't have to go with the new packaging. Could have taken cardboard, could have silk screened it. There were a lot of possible solutions, even in terms of the cans, that we could have done. But I really like the new packaging better. So I think it made the piece better. So like I said, old packaging, new packaging. The shrink wrap, I didn't think, did you just take the shrink wrap, the old shrink wrap, and sort of put it back? Or did you
send it to a shrink wrap company?
Okay. They did a very good job.
Yeah, we did.
They did a great job. Is this before or after it was re-shrink wrapped? After. Yes. Okay. Did we rephotograph the piece? Because I don't have a picture of it. I don't know if we have a picture. So, that's all I have to say about that. This is a piece called Hale to Reason that was made in 2004. And my own private title for this was Balzac in a Prom Dress. So a lot of my works involve more than one element. So this is one side of the piece, and those are packaged doilies. And I made the form first, and the doilies just sort of nestled in there. It went on view first in New York and then in San Francisco. And during the time in San Francisco, because it was an extended exhibition in terms of more than a 1 month time, something happened to the cardboard with the doilies. So I guess through humidity, it sort of shrinks and expands. And since they were just sort of nestled in there into the form, I think you can sort of see that. Curator walked in one day, and there's 4 packages of doilies up there, and one of them was just lying on the floor. So we had to come up with a solution of how to get the doilies back on there. I don't really want to be gluing everything into my work. I kind of like that they're objects in the world, and they have autonomy, and they have integrity, and they're just sort of the way you find them in the 99-cent store. So on this piece, the way to solve this problem was I worked with Michelle Barger at SF MoMA, and we built up the sculpture. So the form, I changed the form, or she changed the form of the sculpture, so we could accommodate the possible change in the cardboard, and the piece could have longevity that way. This is the same piece, Hale to Reason, and this is another view of the sculpture. So that's a portable DVD player that shows a video. And I'm not going to talk about the video. It's a video I shot of an auction, and the only reason why I mention that is that they're holding objects in the video. I was interested. I guess what happened was I was sitting on the subway, and I live in New York, and somebody was watching a movie. It was a bunch of years ago. And I just thought it's really odd to be seeing somebody. I mean, now it's not odd at all, but at the time it was a little odd to see someone watching a movie on their lap on a 15-minute or longer subway ride. So this object and its portability was of interest to me at the time, and has to be in use. This is why I point out that I shot this video. So the concerns we have now about this, so it was shown in New York for a month, and one of the reasons why I bought this particular model of a DVD player was because this had the longest battery life. It wasn't necessarily how the object looked, it was a practical accommodation in that I could the batteries charged at night, and then it could actually be on view for the time of the gallery exhibition. So it went on view at SF MoMA, which has really long hours and many days of the week. So we had to change a couple things. And the first thing was not have it run off the actual player, but to have it come off of a hard drive. So it was run off of a computer, and we had to wire it. So this is a kind of a question for me in terms of this technology. That's why I wanted to show this piece tonight, because the parts, this piece, this is already obsolete probably, but as an object it will become obsolete, and the technology to replace the parts, the screen life, all these things as the models change and as the object no longer exists. So I don't really know the solution to that problem, because I'd like to always see the video here, but I don't know what the solution is. This is a more recent piece. It's called Claude Levi Strauss from 2007. And this was shown in New York and then not my retrospective at Migros. And this was my classical sculpture show, and these were the gatekeepers. So this is one piece, and they were installed so you could walk through them. So all the elements together comprise one work. Just to get into it, there are 2 boxes in this work. One is of a fax machine, and the other is this Priority Mail, U.S. States Postal Service fragile box that was sent to me. And I was concerned about the weight from the structure and the birds that sit on the box, so what would happen over time. So initially I filled it with styrofoam and a couple of bricks, and so it was a little bit more solid and a little bit more weighted, and that seemed to be a temporary solution. More recently worked with Carol and Matthew, who I think are here in the audience tonight, and we came up with an even better solution. So when I made this work, this base was attached to a piece of plywood, so I did that part. And part of the solution now is we added to the bottom these wood supports. So this is how it stands without the box. Registration marks put on the side of the box so the piece would always be positioned correctly. And then this goes inside of the sharp fax machine box. So I've really altered this box, this object now, because I don't care, because you won't see it. So the piece looks exactly the same as it did before. So in terms of this integrity or interest I have in objects and their realness in the world, I wouldn't want this box to necessarily be remade. That seems really fussy, and I don't think it could be replaced. And so it's better to just sort of find a solution where it will withstand structurally. It'll stand a little bit longer. one of the things about the birds is they went from New York to Europe, and we had to get them to clear customs. We had to get them fumigated, which meant just having them sit in bags, fumigation bags, and that was easy. But then they came back with cobwebs. So, or this one in particular did. So I guess I'm just really appreciative of conservators and the work they do, because I wouldn't know how to clean that. And then another issue over time is replacing the feathers. But we don't know yet what that will be. So that's it.
We're going to save questions on these individual artworks until we're all finished talking. Thank you very much. That's great. Doris Salcedo, who's sitting to the right of me, is from Bogota, Colombia. She lives and works there now and travels around, of course, quite a bit. She studied at the university there and then studied also at NYU in New York. Doris has had one-person exhibitions since around 1985 in Colombia and in Switzerland, London, France, and the U.S., with major installations, one of which she is going to talk about tonight, which is called Neither or Neither. Which do you call it?
Either one.
Which she did at the White Cube Gallery in London. And perhaps many of you saw, as I did, the great piece Shibboleth, which is now on view in the Turbine Hall at Tate Modern in London. Doris was in the Carnegie International in the Istanbul Biennial of 2003, and in a show that was very important in the U.S. called Art of the Americas at the University of at the Art Institute of Chicago. Her work addresses the deepest political and historic facts and issues of our present day and our recent past. And in order to do that, she takes on the most difficult materials. So Doris is going to talk about one of the installations, Neither, tonight.
I have chosen Neither. I have chosen to present this piece tonight because the process of making it was entirely a process of restoration. The process of making this piece was a process of mending from the very beginning until the present day. It was, making this piece was a futile attempt to restore reality, as though reality could be amended by a sculptor. It was a vain attempt to mend the interior spaces we inhabit, because I believe our private, intimate spaces have been crossed or have been penetrated by the most extreme form of exteriority. For years, I have kept files about concentration camps, both the historical ones and the contemporary variations of it. And I've been interested in spaces where, as Hannah Arendt wrote, everything is possible. But I was not only concerned with the atrocities that took place and continue to take place in such spaces, but mainly I focused my inquiry in those aspects of our society that make possible the existence of places where the absolute inhuman condition is accomplished. With this piece, I wanted to address the perverse ambiguity that characterizes these spaces where destitute human beings are included in territories that represent the absolute exclusion from society. The concentration camp is not simply a terrible event produced by a sick state. It cannot be reduced to a German perversion, because since 1896, when the Spaniards invented and implemented the first concentration camp in Cuba, until nowadays, that its long history has come full circle with Camp Delta in Guantanamo Bay, I believe the concentration camp have become the essential expression of the political structure of our time. And therefore, the brutal exclusion of concentration camps have been embedded in our lives. I will summarize an extremely long and absurd process of making this piece just in a few steps. The process of making neither implying an exuberant waste of energy and resources. George Hale wrote that it is not necessary, it is not necessity, but it is the excess of luxury what presents mankind its more fundamental process. So the process of making this piece was literal. I wanted to embed a wire fence, the most extreme form of exteriority, into a white wall, an interior space wall. In order to do this, I chose to work with two materials that you see, the wire fence and then just a dry wall, white wall. First, I took the metal fence and I sharpened the entire surface, one side of it, as a knife. And then small grooves were cut into the drywall according to the shape of each single fragment of fence. The fence was not perfect, it was somewhat irregular. Later, we apply glycerin, it's what you've seen in the image, into each single cut on the drywall in order to dissolve the plaster. So when because later I was going to press this, to force this metal into the drywall. So I needed to dissolve the plaster so the drywall would not break or fracture. 1,000 tons of pressure were applied on each single square meter of the surface of the piece in order to bury the metal into the drywall. After this, the process of mending began. In this process, I was trying to obtain different levels of damage. You can see that the piece came out of the press somewhat damaged, and I wanted to retain some of this damage, but also I wanted different degrees of damage to be present, so it would be very difficult to really discern how this piece was made. You can see that this is where the mesh was almost completely embedded on the surface. For me, the ambiguity, the uncertainty of the process is very important in this piece, because it's really the ambiguity and the uncertainty with which we live. So the next step, this is all the mending in the studio. The next step then was assembling together these fragments. It was a huge jigsaw puzzle. It had 340 panels, and each panel was designed in a different shape, an odd shape. In order to achieve a smooth visual transition between one panel and the next. You can see that they suffered great damage in the process. The technique, here we were assembling part of it. The corners, and it was an entire room. The technique we had to use inflicted constant damage on the pieces. We had to weld together different fragments of mesh and then restore the quality of the mesh, which means carving and then painting it. So it looked like the idea was to turn many fragments into a single huge metal fence. So it was constantly, of course, as we welded, it was being burned. So constantly we had to restore it. That was the process was restoring. Here you have one mesh that had already been welded and fixed. The installation of this piece was extremely difficult. It required to place the pieces on this prefabricated metal structure, and then we have to join all these 340 panels. The materials I chose, plaster and steel, do not like each other. If the humidity level is not rigorously and perfectly controlled, the metal begins to rust, and then it begins to stain the drywall. Here we are preparing for the installation, and the process of installation always implies a previous step of restoration, conservation of the panels. So in this piece, I am literally, in order to join each panel, I had to add some paper so it could be installed and de-installed properly. Neither literally juxtaposes interiority with exteriority. It is an interior space that negates the possibility of interiority, of intimacy. Here I'm showing images of the way the jigsaw puzzle was designed. More images of installation, mending constantly until we have the finished piece. And this space, I was saying, is a space that negates the possibility of intimacy, of interiority. And definitely what I was trying to achieve was the impossibility of remembrance in that space. Neither is an indeterminate space located beyond my power to articulate, to understand, and measure the political structure in which we live. It is a space about uncertainty. It is about ambiguity. It is a piece simultaneously located outside and inside the specter, the epicenter of catastrophe. I strongly believe that neither does not have to narrate any story because the experience it is addressing is well known to all of us. It attests to the fact that there is a common frontier between what we see in our television screens and our lives. There is a common frontier between disenfranchised human beings and us. It is a piece suspended in a sort of dead time. It is in a dislocated time that breaks the thread of chronological order. It is not the present time built upon continuous instances. It is rather an immobilized duration where the gathering of memories is suspended. There is a radical silence because I wanted to disassociate my work from the way political art has always represented suffering. Mostly it has been represented as a spectacle, as something we can watch. The implication is that we simply watch, we cannot stop it, and the inactivity of lookers underscore this impotence. For this reason, this is a piece to be experienced. There is nothing to be looked at, and we are left with no words to describe the intolerable. Thank you.
Perhaps you can tell us later about how the piece moved to another location and the challenges that came from that. Paul McCarthy is an artist that I'm sure is known to most of you, since he is somebody who has worked in Los Angeles for many years. Paul started his art school education at the Art Institute in San Francisco. His early performances, beginning in around 1969 and the early 70s when he moved down here, were performed were photographed and are known to us through videotapes still. Early installations were exhibited at, among other places, Lace and at the Rosamund Felsen Gallery. Some of Paul's notable performance videotape work of the 70s are Meat Cake, Hot Dog, Grand Pop, and Tubbing. And they've all involved extreme body transformations by prosthetics, paint, and notorious use of Paul's notorious use of all kinds of materials, most notably in those days, ketchup. In 1992, McCarthy created a full-scale environment for Helter Skelter, which is called The Garden, which he's going to talk about tonight. And after that, many other pieces. Bossy Burger is quite a famous one he's also going to, I think, talk about. Heidi, I remember a piece made with Mike Kelly. Recent large installations have included Caribbean Pirates, which was in Munich in 2005, and London, and Piccadilly Circus at Hauser and Wirth in London in 2003. And this summer, Paul is going to show 2 new works and 1 older work at the Whitney. So,
okay. I can't use this thing; it didn't work. So I have to say next slide. But I'm starting with this piece called The Garden, and I think when I first did the piece, it was at MOCA, and I had a real small budget and about $4,000 or $5,000. And so what was interesting is that I live in LA, and in some way a lot of things can be rented. So what I did was rent everything for the show. And but it was, I built this thing called The Garden, which was essentially a kind of island, and most of the things were movie props. And so the first manifestation, and there were 2 figures which you can see barely in this case, one behind the rock, and then a head up near by the trees. I'll show you more of that. Next slide. When the piece was made, I rented everything, made the 2 figures, which were mechanical. The one figure would hump a tree, and the other figure would hump the ground, and it was an older man and a younger man. And I sort of viewed it as a kind of image of where the 2 men were in collusion, the older man in a way instructing the younger man, and as viewers, we were in a voyeur position surrounding the island, and they weren't aware of us as a viewer, and the viewer looked in on them. It was also sort of, at that time, I was really interested in things like Pirates of the Caribbean and Disney, and I was interested in the aesthetic of Disney, and to some degree attempting to imitate it, but in a very crude way without money. What happened is the piece was disassembled. The 2 figures I kept, and then shortly after that, someone asked me to put it in a show, and then that meant recreating it. And then what I began to do was to try and bring the materials back together, and so I purchased the rocks, and a lot of the rocks were different than the originals, but a lot of the trees, and the original trees had been on the set of Bonanza, and I tried to buy them, but couldn't buy them. But what I could do is rent one and then make a mold of it, and then cast 5 more. So the piece pretty much looked the same as it did in the very original part. One thing changed is that I changed the stand. In the first version, the underneath was made out of wood. When the second stage happened, I made it out of metal. So this is the second stage. Next slide. This is the figure which was humping the ground. Humping the tree, the older man. And at that time, I made these out of mannequins and latex bodies that I sort of sculpted off of. Like I would take a mannequin, sort of sculpt it a little different, then make a mold and cast it in latex with foam rubber. And the top torso was actually a mannequin. The heads were special effects heads, molds that I had gotten from movies. The hands were also prosthetics gotten from special effects houses. So, and I like this idea that somehow these trees were connected to Bonanza, which was also a sort of a male bonding of some sort. And then these two heads were also from the film industry. Next slide. This is the figure on the ground. Again, and they both have the same torso, the same lower torso, but different heads. And then the one thing about the piece is over time, the piece has now been put up about 7 or 8 times, and now there's like complete books of where every tree goes, where every rock goes. And in a sense, it eliminates the conflict. In a way, I don't have to be there at this point. It comes pretty much complete so that someone else could put it up. But what has happened, whenever I do it, then I alter it. And then we make amendments to the book, and it becomes variations. Next slide. After the first showing, the piece was at MOCA. We weren't able to be there when the piece was taken down, so we got there a little late. It was actually the day of the Los Angeles riots, which was going on then, and I had a hard time getting down to MOCA. And I got down there, and the figure on the ground was put over to the side, and it was in this position. And I thought the shirt was pulled up. By the end of the show, the ass had split open, the legs had split open, and it was all from the foam, the rubber, and the inability to make it. It just kept going up and down, and it split everything. And so when they took it off, the shirt got pulled up, which sort of exposed the back, which I'd written all over about, where to put the screws to hold it down. And then the arms had got wrapped around the head, and the legs fell off. And it was sort of in the corner, and at that point, it looked like that it had actually, in a way, represented a real brutality in the way that it was kind of tossed on this grass, which was like clipped grass, almost like a man who had been, possibly raped and then left on the front lawn. And at that point, I always sort of viewed this foam figure and the splits in it and the foam as body. And I'd had this real interest in these sort of soft materials, and when they ripped in clay and things like that as flesh material. And so I wanted to keep the rips. And there had been like an attempt at one point to glue the rips back together, and the glue had gone brown, which then even added another kind of layer to the whole thing. And this then became a separate piece called MOCA Man. Next slide. At that same time, I was asked to do a show at a gallery in Germany, Max Hetzler's gallery. And he had a large desk, and he kept calling me, asking me to do, if I would redo one of the garden figures, and he said it would be really great if I could just put a tree in the middle of the hall, and it would hump this tree in the middle of the hall, and that would, for the show. And I said, well, no, I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to make a small garden. And I'd been to his office, and so I asked him if possibly the same figure could go there, and instead of humping the tree, would hump his desk. And the motor would be put underneath the desk, and then it would sort of lean on the desk. And we went back and forth over this for several weeks, and finally what happened is I just asked him to get a large barrel. And so what the piece became is that I was recycling these figures into other pieces. And next slide. So what happened is over the period of the piece being shown like 8 or 9 times. There's been 3 different male figures, and when the figures completely wear out, or when they begin to not look the same as they did in the original, then I change them out, but then the past figures turn into another piece. This one, so one was the MOCA man, one was Alpine man, and these became the dead men. Next slide. And this is from Rubbing on the Tree. Next slide. This year, next slide. This year, it was always like a big rectangle, and this year I separated it into a sort of a jagged separation, so that you could walk in between it. It's like a kind of broken leg, or like a swastika leg in a sense. And you can walk in between the 2 figures. And so now it became another variation of the same piece. So it's, in a way, the piece is, and to a certain extent, trees to some degrees wear out, and I replace them. And the large trees are always the same. I've added rocks over the years. The grass at times gets lost, I replace it. The figures I replace. The motors wear out, I replace them. Next slide. This was the last configuration. I didn't change the upper torso. I just took the 2 figures, tied them together at the pipes, and stuck them on a barrel in the studio. Next slide. This is the original legs which were used to form the body, and it's mannequins and clay. And the clay is just plastiline, which has now been on this figure for, I guess, I don't know, 17 years. Still seems to, and it's called rabbit ears. Next slide. I guess I'm okay. This is Bossy Burger, and Bossy Burger was a television set that I'd gotten in Hollywood. A friend of mine worked there and said, "Oh, I know where you can get some sets." And it came from Family Affair. It was actually where the teenagers would go to get hamburgers. And as television sets are, they're normally placed in like a U configuration, so the cameras look in onto the set. And I built it as a trap in which you can't get out, or the performer can't get out. It's in a sense an enclosed trap, or an enclosed space, as if the void is all around. And that's kind of a view I had of stage sets anyway, that they sort of exist in these voids. Next slide. So what happened is I did a performance in the set, and when it was over, I then showed the set with the video playing on 2 monitors. Next slide. This is the original performance. Ketchup, there was a lot of ketchup and flour, and it's kind of a cooking show to a degree. I won't get into what it is, but next slide, I'll stick to the subject. This is the character, Alfred E. Newman mask. Next slide. Okay, these are 2 images of it. The piece is put up. What happens, the original tape is always shown with the piece, but the way the piece is installed is that the set is put up, and then I close there's a black curtains now that exist above the door and above the windows. I close the curtains. It's always done late at night when no one's there. And by using the monitor, I redo the performance over again. And So it's now been put up, I don't know, 10 or 12 times, and I redo the performance every time, but without an audience. And I do it by watching the monitor, although I got it pretty much memorized now. But what's happened is, and what most people don't really realize is that the chair which was covered, which ketchup was applied to the chair that sits on top of that sort of counter. The first time it was still yellow and there's a little bit of ketchup. What now exists is that the chair is about, it's a good half-inch thick of ketchup, which is now completely black. At the time, next slide. I don't have a slide actually to show you what's actually gone on behind the counter. There was probably about 6, 7 bottles of ketchup the first time, 2 or 3 sacks of flour, 2 or 3 cartons of milk. Now there's probably about 30 bottles of ketchup and 20 bottles of milk. And they're all in different periods of rotting or turning black. There's also, the first time, there's a turkey bone which is put into the mayonnaise and then put onto the back shelf. And now each time a new turkey bone is used. And so behind the counter are 10, 15 turkey bones, all in sort of sealed bottles. So what's happening to the piece is, although if you look at the videotape, you see the version from 1991, what's there, and it's visible on the counter, is the change in the room. Like there's more ketchup on the wall because each time I spin and hit the wall with ketchup. So now the smudges on the walls are increasing. So the piece has a real change going on, and a buildup is happening. And also a rotting. There's more, the bones, the chicken bones, the turkey bones, things like that. Next slide. Some of the bottles that contain the turkey bones. Next slide. What's happened to some of the ketchup bottles and stuff like that, the mold that starts to appear. There's quite a bit of mold on the piece. Next slide. I'll just show this last thing. This is a piece I did with another artist, Jason Rhodes, in which we were able to get all of the remains from the porta potties at Documenta a few years ago, and we bottled it in these bottles. The bottles are about 3 feet tall, and they're in the shape of in a kind of a beautiful shape of but reminiscent of a sex toy called a butt plug. And the remains, what we did is we took it to a fertilizing company. We got all the shit, took it to a fertilizing company in Germany, and had it freeze-dried. And at the time, Jason's was just about to have a child, and he had this idea that we could re-liquefy it by mixing it with baby oil. So all the freeze-dried shit was mixed with baby oil, poured back into these bottles, and then sealed. It has a stainless steel bottom, and then sealed back up. I have no idea whether the baby oil is effective and whether something's growing in there or not, but I think so far they've been okay. Next slide. We made about 100 of them, and we sold about 4 or 5. Next one. The idea is that we would sell it back to them, but it never really worked. Nobody bought it. And then this is a piece in which we had a similar idea. We took the same mold, and we were asked to do a piece in Iceland, and where there was a lot of, we were trying to figure out what they had that we could use to fill these bottles. There was not much money, and they came up with sheep fat. And so we filled the bottle. We essentially set up a factory to boil sheep fat and poured it into the bottles, and we did. And the black that you can see there is actually the hair from the sheep. And we made about 100 of these sheep fat butt plugs. And some of them were hung by ropes. Most just sat on the ground. Next slide. The piece was shown in Iceland and then traveled to the Pompidou and was in a show in the Pompidou. Jason actually took it to the Pompidou and did a performance with them. And then we didn't know where to put them. And Jason, I was in Europe, but Jason had this idea of putting them down into a basement in some place, I think it was in Strasbourg or something. And this is the opening of the basement. Next slide. And there they went. And they were kept there for several years, a couple of years, I guess. Again, I don't think we ever sold any of them. And they had a really strong smell. And what happened is that we took them from the factory to the gallery in Iceland, and before they went into the door, we spray painted a number on them. That's what the red is. Next slide. And so they were kept down in there. And I actually, Jason sent me these images, and I thought it was a really great idea that they would just be kept there. And we had no intention of taking them out. And we just thought they would just stay there. Maybe at times people could go and see them. And then next slide. Oh, go back. I'm sorry. What did happen, though, this year is we found out that, so it ended up being a very bad idea to put them in this basement. They ended up with mold, and they were completely covered in mold, like a lot of them all black and hairy, these things. And the person who had the basement wanted them out, and the problem is that it's a polluting situation, so we had like a real problem on our hands. And I had talked to Christian about what we might do. Was there a solution? By this time, the sad thing was Jason died, and this all came up after, and so then it was just this thing that I was then sort of strapped with this decision of what to do with these things that Jason had put down in there. And I really liked the idea that they were down there. But and then at one point Christian said, well, we can just remake them. And I said, no, we can't remake them. In a way, what's happened to them, the numbers that are all on those things, that's all from an action or an activity that Jason and I did. There's no way to redo it. They are what they are, and I can't remake them. And in one way, what's happened to them is just part of their story. And the story of Iceland to the Pompidou to this basement, and now mold. And so we can't remake them, and there's no way to get the mold off. You'd have to dig it off, and even if you've stuck it in tried to dry it, you would still have the situation. My solution to it is that, which has kind of become the solution with a number of pieces like this, is that it goes into a cargo container. A window goes on the side, and they're sealed up forever. So it's now the cargo container becomes the sculpture that contains the piece, and you can see through a window what's there, and that's I think the solution. They still exist, and it means, of course, a refrigerator container. So has to have a plug.
I'm going to stop.
I'll stop there.
I would let you go on. Thank you. Christian. You've heard Christian's name many times tonight, but I'll introduce you to him formally. Christian is Senior Conservator of Contemporary Conservation Limited, which is based in New York City now. He studied art history and conservation of old master painting in Munich, I believe, and work, and has then began to work closely, not with old master works, but gradually more and more with living artists. And over the years has, since the late 80s, taken on the work of Robert Gober, Matthew Barney, Zoe Leonard, and Chris O'Feely, as well as all the artists who are seated with us on this podium. Christian has had many challenges from these people, all of these people I've mentioned, and he has risen to all of them, and tonight he's going to talk about a few things that he's experienced and say some philosophical things, perhaps, in addition.
Thank you, Elisabeth. To get into the subject of this conflict, conservation and refabrication, I want to refer to one of the sculptures Paul just mentioned, which is the Alpine Man, the guy with the barrel. And I remember I was scheduled to go to Finland, where this piece is now in a private collection. And so I called the artist, like I would always usually call the artist when there is something, like some decisions to be made. And I said there are problems with the body, with the mannequin. And he said, his idea actually was to replace all these old mannequins with younger men and make a new sculpture of these worn-out fuckers into a worn-out fucker senior's home. Is that correct? So, as you have seen, Paul is particularly creative in maintaining his work. And as you have seen, the other artists also did not really, they are very good in solving these problems themselves somehow, but still, like behind the screen, we are always contacted, and I just wanted to say we are very privileged to work with all these artists because we get a lot of insight in the fabrication, and to work on these pieces in the future, it is necessary and crucial that we understand not only the physical aspect but also the intellectual aspect of it, and the artists are always very helpful to explain these works, and I think it's a very interesting discussion. In the meantime, I think we have introduced a few archival materials into the fabrication of artworks, and I guess this will continue. I'm always concerned about the history of contemporary art, and artists usually, when something does not turn out the way it was planned to be, then the first thing is to remake it. And what I like to introduce, or actually we all conservators like to introduce, is rather to preserve or conserve work of art than to refabricate. The main thing is to keep the authenticity, and the authenticity for me consists of the concept and the idea of the artwork, the context, the political, the social, the historical context, the aesthetical function of the work, and the material aspect. So if all these four factors are kept alive, then I think it's very likely that the work will continue to live. The other thing I want to say, I think the artist is always right. And whatever they do is always right. Sometimes they have, what I think is a hard thing to realize is that everything changes in the art work. And I just want to refer to the Heidi House, which is like a big installation. It's from a photo shoot. It's a collaboration between Paul McCarthy and Mike Kelly, and from 1991, I think, 92, and after 8 years, the collector who owns it, he asked me if I could talk to the artist to think about a solution so that it would not take 3 weeks for 6 people to install the work, but only 3 days for 3 people to install the work, and also that the artist should not always travel to the particular sites. And so I talked to the artists, and they agreed. They both said, yeah, we can do this. The work had been executed in Mike Kelly's studio, and what it turned out that Mike Kelly always wanted to, almost refabricate the work, and Paul wanted to always keep it the way, and every time improve it a little bit and patch up the losses, and so at the end, Mike Kelly was not happy that he could not rebuild it. Paul McCarthy was not happy that he could not keep this fragile situation, which would imply that he would always, or someone would always come and redo the piece. He said, "This is not my house anymore," and I was unhappy because I was in the middle of both. So I think it's a big conflict. I think we can contribute as conservators a lot of science and ethical values into the maintenance of the work, and we do a lot of documentation. There is just INCA to mention one of these networks, the International Network of the Conservation of Contemporary Art, and there are a lot of databases which through conservators the artists can have contact to if they are interested to get a better understanding of the materials they are working with, and we are always happy to make tests and about the longevity of the artworks. But I think we should start the discussion.
Thank you. It's our hope to have a few questions amongst ourselves and then possibly to hear from some of you out there. This question of the materials that you use, Rachel, being available from the 99-cent store. So these wonderful, very vivid sculptures come from those explorations of materials and this fearlessness about putting them together in a way, and they speak very, very eloquently. How do you feel about the life of those works? I mean, do you think that they are challenged for posterity more, let's say, pre-Rauschenbergian time, or do you find the challenge of those works as lasting works? Is that concern you as you have materials?
I accept people age. I accept that objects will age and they'll look different. And they might look, Oh, I was saying that I accept the idea of aging of objects. So I understand that as these are objects from our world, and most of the ones I use don't, for whatever reason, cost very much, or it's not acid-free cardboard. So I accept it as part of what the object is. So I don't think it's going to grow mold like the sheet putty necessarily, but it might start looking a little different, and I think that's okay. Does that answer your question?
It does. I'm trying to
Can I
imagine.
ask him why he thinks artists are always right? Sorry, that's rhetorical. I don't think you can answer.
I think I can answer because I think it's a great challenge to if artists would do like everything right in terms of conservation, then they would probably be more like natural scientists, but not artists. And I think what is really interesting in our profession is to work around all these choices of material, the choice of production, the choice of spontaneity, and I think this is part of the artist's creative process, and that's why I think the artist is like the main person, number one, and we are the servants and the providers.
How do you feel, Paul, if something goes into an institution, let's say the garden was bought by an institution. Has it been the garden, the one?
It's bought by a private collector.
So the fact that parts of it go on evolving, and how do you feel about it? Does anybody own the piece as it was in Helter Skelter? Is there any way of knowing the piece as it was in Helter Skelter?
Well, I mean, it's really close to the piece. I mean, it's the way that it looks right now is excluding the base, which is now metal and is no longer wood. The piece is almost the same. There's a couple of rocks which are, you would if you saw the two photographs, you would say that's not the same rock. But basically that piece looks pretty much the same. The molds are all the same figure. So and when the piece was put up the first time, the figures looked new. The shirt is different. The shirts are different. Shoes are the same. Wigs are the same. The faces are the same. And they both, throughout a show, they wear down about the same. So by the end of the show, now what's happened is that the rubber's not as thin, so the legs and the ass don't split. But pretty much the piece looks the same. Mm-hmm. So, and it comes with enough information that it's not necessary that I'm there. So it's, in a way, can continue. And the molds exist, so it is a piece that you do change the figures when they wear out. That's what happens. And when the figures wear out, I'm the only one that can change, or my studio's the only ones that can, at this point, can remake the figures. We remake them and we keep them. And at the time I sold the piece, I offered the molds to the collector, and he said he didn't want them. And I said, okay. So I make them, and it's part of the instruction. When the piece is shown, they have to use pretty much new figures. So I think it's that piece looks pretty much like it did in 1991. It's pretty much the same piece.
But Bossy Burger chain has changed.
But yeah, and I think the question there with Bossy Burger is the only way to reinstall it each time is to redo the action. Mm-hmm. The question there is who redoes the action when I'm not there. So, and that's how it's put up. I mean, it can't be put up any other way. So I think that someone could, step in and do the action by watching the monitor. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what will happen is that everything that makes up Bossy Burger will just continue to grow, each time it's done.
Doris, do you look forward to change in your work, or do you? If works change over time, hypothetically, does that bother you, or with your own work?
Well, yeah, I think most of my work is ephemeral, and I'm aware of it, because the combination of materials is never right. It's always the wrong material going with the two materials that repel each other. So works will always change, continuously will change, and I think they are ephemeral, and that's fine. That's part, and that is important. If I didn't want that, I could be working on marble or bronze or something else. So it is important because it is intimately related to what I wanted to say at some point, what I wanted to convey at some point. So it's fine if they change. That's the nature of it.
Did you want to ask Christian? Did Christian answer that? Did you ever have a experience where you asked a conservator in before you started to work on something, or?
No.
Uh-huh. You never saw.
We really just met yesterday.
No.
No. I mean, I guess I asked Christian that question because I thought it would help me answer your question in terms of why I would not only accept aging, but like Doris said, and I appreciate it, we're not working with marble. There's a reason, right? There's a reason about what these materials communicate. In my case, what these objects may or may not communicate. Maybe they fail to communicate. Maybe in the future they'll fail in a greater way. They don't look as good. I don't know. But that kind of, what may become, and I had a piece I didn't show, but I considered showing that it's a cardboard box that's for Campbell's beans. I once went to a yard sale, and it was like the free box at the end of a driveway. Like everything in the box was free, and I didn't want anything in the box, but I noticed that the box was really, really old. So it made me. And so the box is so old it doesn't have a barcode on the bottom. So I'm like, oh, it's an antique box. So I basically made a pedestal for it. Because it's an antique cardboard box. Mm-hmm. So in terms of it already looked pretty beat up by the time it came to me. Mm-hmm. But in terms of what he was saying about how artists make things and spontaneity, I mean, if I start to consult him, my work could get worse. So I mean, to have this consciousness, maybe is this what you're describing? Because that didn't upset him that I said that.
No, no.
That maybe it's not necessarily like, oh, I'm all spontaneous, because my decisions are very considered, and my choice of objects are very specific, and also it's very specific where I put them in the works. So it's not like, oh, it just has to have a can of Coke in there in terms of where it sits, because of my interest in form and space. So in terms of overly, I mean, I don't know, Paul, could you have thrown ketchup all over the walls initially? Did you know at the time that the accumulation would become an interest of you, and for you, in terms of it becoming black, or these layers, or the remaking when you first made that piece? Did you have the consciousness then that it would be, 70 years later?
When I made it, I didn't consider how I would put it up a second time or a third time. It sort of came after that. And then it seemed the only solution to how to put the piece up again. There wasn't another. I didn't know how to arrange. I didn't want to arrange a splatter. I do have pieces. With different pieces, it seems like I've adapted different ways of dealing with them. I have pieces which an action only happened once, and it's been put up again and again, but the action isn't redone. And what's happening is that in one case it's chocolate, and the chocolate is beginning to fade, or it's beginning to be eaten by bugs, and there's mice in it that have stuck to it, and it's completely changing, and it's dusty, and I don't wipe the dust, and so in some cases it's just particular to Bossy Burger that I decided to redo it, but it's not the case of every one of them. So some pieces are completely changing, and to some degree that effect of the action is beginning to fade, and I've been I've made these chocolate sculptures lately, and I think that how long they last is hard to say. 50 years, 5 years, but they definitely change, and they will go away. I mean, they're not gonna exist forever. So, in some cases, I'm okay with pieces that. And are completely okay with pieces that have different lifespans. Like some have a lifespan of, I don't know, stainless steel lifespans of thousands of years, and some have lifespans of 15 seconds. And I think that art can exist in that range. One of the things I think the market is driving this whole concern for art to continue to exist for infinity, and it completely limits what art can be and what materials you can use. It's a total fabrication of how we see art and what the market does to art, and it's eliminated, or in people's minds, the possibility of using materials or things that have no longevity, So I think the range, I exist with materials in ranges, and one doesn't outweigh the other. I'm as interested in 10 seconds as I am as in infinity.
It's a strange sort of parallel situation to the dematerialization of art period, of the late 70s, when there's this kind of potential of there being nothing to put in the institutions or in the market. You could say that with the sort of widespread of interest in materials of all sorts without longevity in mind, that we could be, left from this period with sort of emptiness because we weren't able to preserve things, we meaning institutions and collectors, that artists were making. And so we would possibly end up with little to show for this decade, possibly. Well, I think we could now throw this open, if that's okay with you all, to questions from the audience. So is there a system for handing a microphone around that we could? We've got one coming down the aisle here. So is there anybody who would like to start this off? Here's somebody over here, I see.
I'm curious, since I work for an institution that collects art, how the artists would help us to determine if work does change over time, at what point, if ever, it becomes not exhibitable or not their work. Any or all of you.
I think what is important is to maintain the piece alive. I think in the process of conservation and restoration, sometimes in the process of with the good intention of preserving the piece, sometimes the piece is killed. I think the point should be to keep a piece that has the meaning and where the material is able to convey what the artist's intention was. But I think in some cases we can see pieces that have been taken beyond that point in order to preserve them. And I understand they have a value and it is important, but there should be a limit. And I think we have to understand that there is that the pieces are not eternal, that the materials are fragile. And in a way we have to accept that. There are other ways to record the pieces. And we have to accept that there are some pieces that are ephemeral. And keep them alive.
Yeah, I think just the way that Paul was saying before, as artists we're interested in 1 second or eternity, that it's case by case and artist by artist. And I've already been actually kind of impressed in a very positive way. Like I can complain, I was just whispering to Elisabeth everything that he was saying about the market right now speeding up also production, that I believe so many artists are making things that you're not even supposed to look at or experience. Like it's just such a stand-in for a thing. But that aside, institutions have just asked me, like if you can bother to fill out a consignment form or an invoice or write a check. You could be like, oh, how do you feel about aging? Or how should we take care of this? And then if the artist is not present, there's usually someone, a gallery or an estate. Or, that already I've been lucky to have good fortune with some institutions that have asked me those exact questions. So, and also to go back to case by case, artist to artist, I think every artist feels differently about these issues. So I would never, this is just how I feel, and we all feel differently about this, and case by case, work by work, that each work is also different. And the questions and materials that arise from that.
I think there's also this question of when a piece is completed and when an artist knows whether a piece is completed. And at times something may feel like there's a completion, you've finished it, and then you realize something about it, and then it changes, and then you realize that you're interested in that change. So maybe you give one answer, and 2 or 3 years later there's another answer. I know that when Christian was talking about the thing that happened between Mike and I mean, we resolved it in some way, but I realized when we went to change the piece that I was really interested in how screwed up. We had actually asked someone in Austria, we were working with a gallery, we asked somebody, she arranged for someone to build this set, and she convinced this dealer that this guy was a really good carpenter. And when we got there, we realized he knew nothing. And I mean, really, he had somehow convinced her, and she was convinced, and he made this thing in this really stupid way and nailed it together or didn't nail it together. It was structurally, to put it back together was so difficult. Each time we took it apart, we had to re-screw it and I became really interested in how this thing was made, that in some ways it looked like it was made by someone who had no skills for carpentry, and made it from boards that he sort of found around Vienna in crates, and it all of a sudden got really interesting to me, and I was sort of interested in this guy him personally, and so but that didn't occur right away. It really began to happen when we actually began to tear the thing apart. I began to see it as having his action on it, where it was a type of performance for me. It was part of the piece now. So, and then Mike's wanted to return the piece to how we had envisioned it, because the piece wasn't how we envisioned it. And so it was this kind of, and I could see Mike's view, because I envisioned it that way. And then I just became interested in this weird thing that had happened. And we couldn't, in the end, it kind of went, we remade it, because I think it was better for, in one way, the collector, it could be put up over and over again. The way it was is maybe it could be put up 3 more times, and then that was it. That would be the end of the piece. It wouldn't be able to be put up, because you couldn't even drive a screw into the boards they were breaking. So there was it was a kind of, it wasn't just about your view that we were preserving it. It wasn't just about that preservation that I was interested in. That really wasn't it. It was really, I became interested in seeing this person building it as part of the performance, or I don't mean performance, but part of the action or activity that made this object. So it was actually a little more about, which is maybe a difference in how Mike and I see art. In one way, I think I've always been, and it's maybe an age difference, but I was influenced maybe a lot by fluxus and the ideas of happenings or art in life. And Mike, I don't think sees art, I mean, he's certainly interested in that version of art, but it comes from a different view of what's interesting about culture for the two of us. And so anyway.
Can I just say, I think artists usually are not very aware of how long a work would last or about the maintenance of a work until something happens. And what I think is really interesting in our profession to talk to artists is how they become aware and how they become creative during the process of thinking, what did I actually do? And like, do I want the fruits to be preserved? Do I want the donuts to be preserved? Or is it more about still life and decay? So I think this aspect, or this philosophical aspect, is really interesting. And I think, Paul, when we talked about the preservation of the piece, you didn't know in the beginning what you want. You just started thinking about it.
Yeah,
and Mike, the same.
Yeah, I think that's why I'm saying in the answer to the question of institutions, sometimes the question's asked, what do you want us to do when this thing happens, when this happens? Yeah. And I think sometimes an artist doesn't know right then. Maybe it takes time to figure out.
Yeah.
And you live with a piece, and maybe living with a piece doesn't mean 2 weeks or 3 months. It might mean 5 years or 20 years, you know. So you begin to kind of figure out something.
In the back, there's a question.
Hi, I'd like to challenge part of what you all are saying, and specifically Christian's suggestion that the artist is always right, and put out another thought that maybe the artist is always right close to production, but after a sale of a work of art and an artist enters a contract with an institution who acquires it, I wonder if then there are other, for lack of a better word, stakeholders that enter into a discussion or a negotiation of what is right. And so it's not only the artist over time, but the artist and the owner and other players. Unless it's specified at the point of sale, or if it's known about a specific artist or work of art, that they do always want to have the right to change it. And I think maybe if that's understood from the beginning, then the artist does presumably have the right to keep changing it and changing it. So I think it's just a little more complicated than just saying the artist is always right.
Sure, yeah.
That's absolutely true, Glenn. I was referring to it in terms of during the production, the artist is always right, and the whole process is something that you should really respect and acknowledge as part of the work. We are often asked, who do you feel responsible? Towards whom do you feel responsible when you work on an artwork? Towards the artist or towards the collector? And my answer would always be towards the artwork, because as I said, we want to give a history to the artwork, and we would always ask the artist, and we would listen to the collector, but we would not necessarily follow their ideas, because we want to make the artwork somehow independent of changing minds of artists or collector. And I think that's a very challenging job, to keep the work independent. I mean, of course, the intention, the integrity of the work should always be kept, the authenticity of the work should be kept. But we have experienced over many, many years that artists always change their mind, and we want to protect the artworks in a way from the artist.
I think that's right, but at the same time, I think that it's important to take advantage of while the artist is alive. The knowledge that the artist have of the piece is important, sure, and should not be excluded.
No.
It is a delicate point, but if you have an artist that is alive and is willing to work on the piece I think the artist sometimes, even though the artist might bring or include a small change in the piece, it's sometimes, and most of the times, a million times better than these processes of making a piece like petrify by a process of an extreme process of conservation. So I think the artist should. I'm not saying that it's always right, but if the artist is alive, a dialogue and a joint effort between the artist and the conservator is always the best thing for the work.
I agree.
There's a question over here.
Thanks. I have a question for Rachel, and it's a question about the distinction between a box that can support the weight of a sculpture on its own and one that has another secret box inside of it holding up the sculpture. As a viewer of art, I'm someone who's always sort of poking behind things and looking to see what's supporting something else. And you said that there isn't a distinction, and I guess I'm wondering, because one thing I enjoy about your work is this very improvisational quality that certain pieces have, and sort of problem meets solution thing that's happening in your pieces. So I wonder if you take putting the box in there to be kind of conceding to a total image of the work, an image that's successful and that you know is going to be sustained, versus one that's sort of maybe collapsing, or you don't know what's going to happen to the piece, versus like more of a contextual experience of the work, where I'm, as a viewer of your work, I'm sort of recognizing that you made a decision, a problem, meets a solution. You might have had this box in your studio, you sort of stuck it under there, and let's see what happens. So I guess I'm wondering, do you take it to be a concession, or is it really just the ideal way to make the piece?
In that particular case with the boxes, I feel completely, and I think that's a great question, and I appreciate the specificity of it. I feel completely comfortable because it's absolutely invisible. Like, it absolutely looks like that thing is sitting on there. And it was the moment in the studio where they just needed to be taller. But it's also about communication, because it's a fax machine and the mail system. So it's also about transit and movement. So there were all these reasons why those boxes were the correct boxes. I'll tell you when the concession happened is the portable DVD player. And I lost sleep over it, and I still do. I feel like that's the one I made an error. And to go back to the speed of everything in the art world right now being that is, I don't think artists are always right. I think artists make tons of mistakes, and I think tons of their work is crap. And everything happens so fast. What are you going to do? Things change. We have to respond to situations, when mold grows and all this kind of stuff. And, you just don't know how the world's going to change. So I wish the portable DVD player was still portable, because by running it off a hard drive, it had to be wired into an institution. So that was more of a problem than the box.
Thank you. I'm afraid we have to stop. I'm very sorry, but thank you all very much.